Hello everyone, welcome to the latest dose of science news from New Scientist. I'm Rowan Hooper, joined today by Penny Sarche. Hi Penny.
Hi Rowan.
How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. I've been immersing myself in questions of bird intelligence this week for a bit of escapism, and I'll be revealing why later in the show. We've also got another great escapist story for anyone who needs one right now. It's a study showing the engineering prowess of gophers.
We're going to start with COP29 Climate Summit. It's in Azerbaijan at the moment. As we heard in last week's show, there's a lot to be wary of, basically. It's a climate conference held in a petrostate. It's one of the most corrupt countries in the world. The CEO was secretly filmed making oil and gas deals. It's fair to say we didn't have the greatest expectations, perhaps, going into this COP.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say over the last few years it's been quite hard to sort of keep the faith about COP. It increasingly feels like big business interests are sort of capturing it. Yeah,
well, whenever I feel this sort of wavering, I go to Christiana Figueres, and she negotiated the Paris Agreement, of course, and she says we need to balance outrage with optimism. So that's what I'm going to try and do.
Oh, I wish you luck with that, Rowan. Let me know how you get on. So as we said, we're in the middle right now of the climate negotiations, and they started with two pieces of news, really, which climate reporter Madeleine Cuff is here to tell us about.
Hi guys. Yeah, so the first piece of news is this report, which is an annual report from the Global Carbon Budget, that shows that human-caused CO2 emissions are set to reach a massive 41.6 gigatons this year, and that's a 2% rise on 2023's record high.
And that's bad news because, they really were supposed to start falling, right?
There were some high hopes that 2024 could be the year that emissions plateau or start to fall as part of a kind of systemic decline. And of course, countries promised at last year's COP meeting in Dubai to start transitioning away from fossil fuel use. So at first glance, they're not really living up to that promise.
Maddie, in the spirit of outrage and optimism, can we find a bit of optimism in so far?
Yeah, happy to step into the role of resident optimism reporter.
Make a nice change, yeah.
So there is a few bits of cheer that we can take from this report. The first is that emissions in China, which, as we'll remember, is the world's largest emitter, they're only projected to increase this year by 0.2%, and that's within the margin of error that they could even be flat or falling. So that's really good news if the world's largest emitter is finally bending its emissions curve. And the US and EU emissions are also declining. India is now the one to watch with some of the fastest growing emissions, and they are expected to increase by almost 5% this year. But that's still a little bit of good news because in 2023, they increased by much more than that. So it's a lower increase for India than it was last year.
Okay. All right. So, let's see how we carry on with this balance between outrage and optimism. What about the chatter of keeping 1.5 degrees alive? Because we're hearing that still, and it's just, come on. It's dead, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think we've got to separate the rhetoric that comes with these COP summits around 1.5, which is used to really kind of build momentum and keep everybody on the same page, and to keep the kind of global alliance around climate action together versus the scientific reality, which is that we are incredibly unlikely to limit warming to 1.5 without any overshoot, without temperatures rising above that, and then we pull them back down. So there's kind of parallel realities when it comes to 1.5.
Polite way of putting it.
Yeah. And that's obviously a big topic of debate at the summit, but we've got some new analysis this week that also shows that this magic threshold may already have been passed. So it all depends on where you're measuring it from. In the Paris Agreement, it talks about using a pre-industrial baseline to judge how much temperatures have risen by, but they don't quantify when that baseline should start. Now, most scientific literature uses a baseline of between 1850 and 1900 because that is when we first started to get reliable temperature records. But two British scientists believe they've come up with a new method to produce a truly pre-industrial baseline. Anyone who's done GCSE history will know that in 1850 the Industrial Revolution was already in full swing. So we can't really judge the start of human activity on the climate from then. But these scientists have figured out a way of extracting air from ice cores to assess what global temperatures would have been before the Industrial Revolution kicked off. So we're talking before 1700s here. And using this method, they say that humans have already caused 1.49 degrees of warming up to 2023. So basically they're saying that if we start from well before the Industrial Revolution, we have already caused 1.5 degrees of warming in the world.
I mean, given that we're not even accepting the current way of measuring it, I feel like if these guys are onto a loser to try and suggest we should move the goalposts a bit, right? No one's going to be happy with that, are they?
Yeah, it certainly is not going to be a case of everybody rewriting their goals to fit this new baseline, but it does provide a really timely reminder of just how much we have changed the Earth's climate at a time where we have world leaders in one room to talk about this big issue.
The other thing I saw was the report from Climate Action Tracker. That's the project that measures how government policy maps on to expected temperature increases. And there they say we're on track for 2.7 degrees of warming with under current policies. Yeah,
and that is rather sobering, but it's worth mentioning that is based on current government policies in place. And the picture does get slightly rosier if you take into account vaguer government plans to reach net zero by a certain date, for example. So this is only policies that are in the system right now,
right.
not promises for the future. So there's a slightly better picture if everybody lives up to their promises. But the other thing that we should remember about climate change and COPs, that it's really easy to forget the global vulnerability to this issue. So we've been talking about how Azerbaijan are the hosts of this summit and that they are very reliant on fossil fuels for their economy. But what we forget is that this COP is being held in a region, Azerbaijan and the other nations that border the Caspian Sea, they're all highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So this is kind of really on their doorstep as a pressing issue to deal with.
I've just got an image of the meme of the dog in the room with the house on fire saying this is fine. And that's Azerbaijan.
Exactly. Yeah. So the Caspian Sea, which Baku sits on, the port of Baku, the sea level of the Caspian Sea is already declining and climate change is making that much worse. Projections suggest that under a scenario, even if we limit warming to 2 degrees, which, let's face it, is probably the best case scenario right now, water levels will drop between 5 and 12 metres this century. And under a worst case scenario, water levels could drop 21 metres. And that is probably hard to visualise, but that would have a massive impact on countries in this region.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds massive, potentially 21 metres. What kind of thing might you imagine would happen?
Yeah, it's basically a complete reshaping of the coastline of this area. So that is obviously a tragedy for the ecology and the wildlife of the region, much of which is unique and native to this region. We've got the Caspian seal that's found nowhere else in the world, and it would lose its safe breeding grounds and habitats. The Caspian Sea is also a really vital migratory route for birds. But the other thing, and this kind of comes back to the dog in the burning building meme, is that this would have a massive economic impact for Azerbaijan and other countries. This is where oil production happens. This is where gas drilling happens. There are ports, there are ships for moving all of these fossil fuels around. And as the sea level from the Caspian Sea declines, that infrastructure essentially becomes landlocked. So they'll be left with huge numbers of stranded assets and billions of dollars worth of damage due to the impacts of climate change. And it's just rams home why having climate summits like this are incredibly important to take action, because in the future it is the countries that are hosting these summits that will end up paying the price.
Yeah, literally stranded fossil fuel assets. You'd think that I always think that something that will break through finally will be an economic argument like this, but they're yet to still really break through. Let's talk about the COPs themselves, right? Because I think we dance around the subject a lot. Is it time to give up on the COPs? It's a very contentious issue, but I spoke to Rupert Read about this. He's a climate philosopher. He runs something called the Climate Majority Project, and this is a way to drive grassroots activism and drive change from the bottom up. And I asked him for his thoughts on the COP process, and here he is.
The news that the administrative head of COP was using COP to make oil and gas deals it's hardly even a surprise anymore, and that tells one something about the poor state in which, tragically, this institution has now found itself. This could have an upside. My own view has been for some time that it would actually be a good thing if the COP process started to become more thoroughly questioned, because then people would take more seriously the creation of emerging alternatives to it, such as the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and more generally the phenomenon of climate clubs. What we need is coalitions of the willing, nimble groups of countries getting together to agree things that they can and will actually agree on and leading the way, rather than the huge lumbering process of COP, which, as has been made clear by Simon Sharp in his very important book, 5 Times Faster, was pretty much designed to fail. What's the most important and useful thing that COP could do now? Well, what about if there were to be a general admittance that, as James Hansen has said, 1.5 is deader than a doornail? That would actually be useful. What about if there were a huge pivot to adaptation? This is what we're calling for in the Climate Majority Project. It's time now to centre transformative and strategic adaptation, to admit that our hopes for a smooth green transition are pretty much deader than a doornail, and instead to lean into the terrible storms of the future, which we got a taste of this autumn with the awful worldwide flooding events that shook, frankly, even the likes of me. So we're saying in the Climate Majority Project, let's have a real pivot to adaptation. Let's make that the centre of our concerns. No longer pretend that we can get through this by a decarbonisation-centric approach. And if we were to actually get serious about funding and doing adaptation in our own countries and the world over, including, of course, a massive dose of adaptation finance, that would probably be the single most useful thing that we could do now. Not least because by making the problem, the emergency, so much realer to everyone, we would actually fuel progress on mitigation and decarbonisation as well.
That was Rupert Read of the Climate Majority Project. There's lots to talk about from there. Maddie, we'll always have Paris from COPs, but what do you make? What COP's designed to fail?
Oh, there's so much to pick up in there, and Rupert makes some really interesting points. I mean, I would say that anyone who has sat through 2 weeks of a COP is not there because they want to make mischief. They're there because they genuinely think that getting engaged in this process is going to make a difference. And I think if we actually look at the evidence of the Paris Agreement and how it's performed since Paris, yes, we're not moving anywhere near fast enough. And yes, there's much, much more to do to get onto the track that we need to. But it's evident that there has been progress. There has been a global shift to making more ambitious targets. The financial economy around clean energy, around renewables, has really ramped up in response to the signals that have been sent by COP. And I think maybe that's what we've got to think about when we think about this process. Yes, it's lumbering. Yes, it's divorced from the reality of what we're seeing on the ground. But it is an incredibly important forum, not only for countries to have their voices heard, but also for the world to send a signal to the marketplace to say this is the direction of travel. And that's really its kind of core function, is that signalling function. And I think, I mean, one point that I wanted to pick up on from Rupert's contribution is where he talked about the need for the coalitions of the willing. And I actually can't agree more. Now that we've got the text of the Paris Agreement, these COPs, yes, there's some detail around financial goals, and yes, there's some process to work through, but all the action at these summits is not in the negotiating rooms with the people looking at, the line by line technical text. The action is in getting these countries together and getting them to launch fresh efforts to tackle these various issues. So really, it's an excuse, it's a date in the diary for countries to work to come forward with new plans. And that function is more valuable than anything else. So I think it is a bit defeatist, to be honest, to write off COPs. I think they play a really valuable role in the tapestry of global climate action.
Am I foolish one of the ways I sort of try to at least give myself some hope is I think I remember a time, maybe Glasgow, where all of this tracking of government commitments had us at above 3 degrees of warming, and we've come down to about 2.7. Am I misremembering that?
No,
there has been some progress, and even though 2.7 is still going to be disastrous,
without the COPs would be even worse.
Yeah, and every 0.1 of a degree makes a really big difference. So for all this talk of 1.5 is dead, okay, so you go for 1.6, 1.7, each degree, each fraction of a degree is important.
Absolutely, and I think that is why the community at large is finding it so hard to let go of 1.5, because the fear is everybody will hold up their hands in despair. And actually, it's about how to land that narrative of, yes, every 1/10 of a degree matters, and that we need to be aiming for as low a temperature rise as we can. So I think that is the challenge, is how do you be realistic without being defeatist, and how do you still continue to drive that momentum?
And what about the point of the pivot to adaptation? And he does say that obviously we still need mitigation, and he thinks that once we are showing success at adaptation, that will fuel is the wrong word, perhaps, that will boost mitigation.
I mean, I absolutely agree that adaptation needs more money, it needs more focus, it needs more time in the spotlight. It is incredibly important. But I think as a vehicle for convincing people of the merits of mitigation, it won't quite work. People don't recognise what hasn't happened to them. Like, how many times do you know that a seawall in front of a harbour has prevented a town from flooding? You don't, because the seawall's done its job. So I think absolutely we need to be pouring more resources into particularly helping poorer countries adapt to the changes that are already baked in. But it also absolutely cannot come at the cost of mitigation, which is our only route out of this problem.
I'll put a link to Rupert Read's Climate Majority Project in the show notes, and a link to his book on this as well. So do go and check that out for more. Thanks, Maddie.
Next up, let's reset a bit with
Please.
a palate cleanser for us all. We've got 2 really interesting new studies this week that look at what I think are 2 of the sort of biggest scientific questions in ornithology. One is, how do birds migrate? And the other is, how did they evolve from much earlier dinosaurs?
Okay, migration first.
Okay, so I wanted to set the scene a bit here. It's such an interesting subject. Bird migration is this huge thing that we know that many species do, and we watch them do it, especially at this time of year. We've got all kinds of ducks and geese coming to the UK. And it's really familiar. It's been studied extensively. All kinds of birds have been looked at. But we still don't really know how they do it, which is amazing. And we have loads of different pieces of this puzzle. We know that, for example, some birds use physical landmarks or the night sky to find their way. There's genetic evidence. Some birds seem to have like a genetic predisposition to fly in certain directions. But we still don't have this full picture of how millions of birds are finding their way these enormous distances around the planet, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's weird that we still don't know that. What about the magnetic field? Don't they have a sort of internal magnetic field detection?
Yes, exactly. So we know that some birds, like the robin, for example, the European one, not the American one, can sense our planet's magnetic field. And they probably do this using chemicals in their eyes. But again, we still don't really know. And what they do with this magnetic field is they use it as a sort of compass. So we've known that, sort of suspected that for quite a long time. But this new study this week found that some birds, at least, can get even more information from this magnetic field. So not just knowing, like a compass will tell you this way is the way you want to go, but also helping them pinpoint their actual position.
So it's Google
on a
Maps.
Google Maps for birds in their brains,
nice.
Which is pretty cool.
Do we know how that works and how we've managed to figure that out?
Yeah, so a lot of bird migration studies do this thing where they put birds that want to be migrating into a sort of special, it's like a cone-shaped cage. It's quite strange, but it enables researchers to observe kind of where the birds would ideally like to be going. And it's pretty low-tech. There's like ink on the floor and you can sort of track their footprints. It's a bit sad to think of them kind of desperate
yearning
to move.
to go in that direction.
I know, it pulls on the heartstrings a bit. This thing using, it's called an Emlyn funnel, by the way. But for this experiment, it got a clever upgrade. So the researchers used something called a Helmholtz coil to interfere with the magnetic field. And by tweaking sort of two aspects of this magnetic field, they basically told reed warblers that they were 2,600 kilometers away in Russia rather than in Austria, where they actually were at the time.
Wow, just with the magnetic field that can...
Yeah.
Wow. I wonder if they had to use different dialect in their songs when they were in Russia and not Austria.
I wonder if they do have different dialects. It's entirely plausible. So when the team artificially changed these sort of two details of the magnetic field to match this distant Russian location, the birds then showed a clear preference for in this special cone thing for flying west-southwest, which you would expect out of Russia, rather than south-southeast out of Austria, which is where they should actually have been flying.
Do they all do that, do we think? I suppose only migrating birds need that level of...
Yeah, so exactly. And also even within migrating birds, we don't know that they all do exactly the same thing. And so there's been all of these studies that have found different things. One of my favourites is the Caspian tern. Only a few years ago, we learned that to some extent their dads show them the way the first year, and that's really important for teaching them where to go, which is really cute. So that is one of the reasons that we know not everything we liked about migration, because just because you find something in one bird doesn't mean it's true for all the other species of migrating bird.
Does the migration tell us anything about bird intelligence?
So I like to think it does. So, of course, historically, we've tended to think of birds as being quite stupid, right? They have small heads, bird brain as a phrase. And then over time, that's changed a lot. We now look at crows and parrots as these sort of paragons of other types of animal intelligence. But, crows and parrots, they're kind of like us, really. They're really sociable and they solve problems. So that's a kind of relatable intelligence for us. But lots of birds, including, quite small-brained ones, migrate. And it's really tempting to think of that like, it's in their genes, it's their ingrained instinct, it's something they do sort of automatically. And perhaps if they're sort of sensing these magnetic fields, then maybe they're not really thinking about them. But I don't think that's the case, because a lot of them that will use the Earth's magnetic field to navigate, they're also combining that with information from what they can see, remember, cues in the night sky from stars or the moon. So that, to me, implies, it's not just an automatic response to this internal compass. And to back myself up on that, I have this second study this week, and it's this beautiful 80-million-year-old fossil of a bird that is so well preserved that scientists have amazingly been able to reconstruct the structure of its brain.
I'm just trying to run the numbers. So is that a bird or is it a dinosaur?
That's a good question. It's kind of, it's definitely a bird, and it's sort of halfway between Archaeopteryx, which is this iconic kind of earliest bird-like dinosaur. It's halfway between that and now, pretty much.
Okay, early bird.
Yeah, early bird, but not the very first bird. And what they found when they reconstructed its brain, this bird Navornis, it had a bigger brain than dinosaur predecessors, but it's not as big as bird brains today. And in particular, the bits that are smaller in this early bird and bigger in today's birds are things to do with complex cognition and also spatial observation. So that kind of hints at the kind of brain power that birds have since evolved and now might be using to find their way thousands of miles across the Earth.
Wow. So I wonder if dinosaurs migrated.
I know. I'd love to know.
Maybe birds were the smart offshoot of dinosaurs and dinosaurs were the not so smart ones. Don't know. Thanks, Penny. We're going to post a link to those stories in our show notes, and you can see that fossil. Go and look at the fossil. And thanks to the writers for that. That's Krista Leste-Lassar and James Woodford. We'll post a link to those stories.
Have you had a productive day, Rowan?
Yes, I've been getting the podcast ready.
So productivity, it's pretty trendy, isn't it? All about achieving as much work as you can in as little time possible. And by that definition, I think gophers might have us all beat, right, Sophie?
Yeah.
So this is the news that one day of work by a single gopher can affect landscape for decades afterwards.
That's right.
So Sophie Bushwick is here to tell us all about it. First off, we don't actually have gophers in the UK. Can you tell us what they are?
You are missing out. So I'm specifically talking about the northern pocket gopher. It's this furry rodent about the size of a rat, and it has these long yellow-stained front teeth, which I'm realizing this does not sound very appealing, but I think they're kind of cute. The reason that they're called pocket gophers is not because they fit in your pocket, but because they have these fur-lined cheek pouches or pockets that they can just pop food in, which, makes them little round things. But anyway, the main point is that this is a burrowing mammal, and it lives all over Western North America, or under it, really, because it mostly stays below ground. They dig these tunnel systems with hundreds of feet long, and even when they do leave their burrows, they usually stay within a few feet of the opening.
Wow, really subterranean then, aren't they?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what is this new experiment with these allegedly cute animals?
I mean, the results are new, but the experiment started decades ago. This is after the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens in Washington State. And if you look at before and after photos, you can really see how the blast just devastated the landscape around the volcano. And in particular, there was this formerly forested area now called the Pumice Plain, where pyroclastic flows buried the local flora and fauna under this thick layer of ash and volcanic material. And then a couple years after that, researchers airlifted these individual gophers to the Pumice Plain and put them in these little enclosures and then let them burrow around for 24 hours before removing them. And more than 40 years later, they surveyed the microbes in the gopher enclosures and they compared them to the soil nearby, and there were clear differences. So areas that gophers, 40 years
later.
later.
Sort of far-sighted, I'm going to put these gophers here for one day and then we'll come back. Here's my grant proposal.
It reminds me of like the pitch drop experiment, one of these really long-term things where you have to wait a really long time for it to pay off.
Yeah, amazing.
So this was the plan. This wasn't something else they were doing, and they've since found out they had a long-term effect. They genuinely said, I'm going to put a gopher here.
And see what happens.
40 years later. Amazing.
And so what happened was areas the gophers got access to, they had more diversity in the soil microbes in those areas, and particularly mycorrhizal fungi. These are microbes that can boost plant growth. They colonize plant roots, and that can help prevent disease and help the plants access nutrients. And in these areas with the greater diversity and more mycorrhizal fungi, they also had more vegetation. And as a result of the extra plants, they had less soil erosion. And this is decades after the gophers had departed.
But, I mean, I get it in that, subterranean engineering that has all these lovely effects. But after one day, it has that.
Yes. So part of it is
stunning.
Yeah, the gophers, by digging, they were sort of bringing buried soil microbes back up to the surface again. And they carried microbes of their own. So behind their little digging claws, they had microbes that they left behind. And they also, left their droppings all over the area. So their internal microbes were in that area.
Wow. Should we move gophers to other areas that have had, volcanic activity and help it, rewild those areas?
I mean, it's definitely a possibility. Also, after something like a wildfire or after logging and clear-cutting an area is not great for the soil microbes. Actually, in this study, the researchers looked at, when they were comparing the gopher enclosures to other areas, that included areas that didn't have as deep a layer of volcanic material on top. And some of those areas had, before the eruption, been forested. Some of them, at least one of them, had been clear-cut. And even all those years later, the area that had been clear-cut had less microbe diversity than the area that was forested. And they were both less diverse than the gopher areas. So, I think it's a possibility. You could have a mission to bring these gophers into disaster zones, airlift them in, let them go.
Wow.
Is that pretty rough going for the poor gophers, though?
I mean,
they're only rats.
But cute rats.
Yeah.
And they're also really sturdy. A lot of northern pocket gophers actually survived this devastating volcanic eruption. A couple days afterwards, researchers were in helicopters, going over the area, and they saw the mounds from burrows. Yes, the gophers had burrowed back up to the surface, and they could see the openings. Yeah.
Amazing.
Thanks, Sophie. That's amazing, and always good to learn about gophers.
Love the gophers, yeah.
That's it for this week. Thanks to all our guests and thanks to you for listening. Do tell your friends about us, give us a 5-star rating and a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen.
That's all for this week. Thanks. Bye. See you next week.
Bye.